Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kufferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's event is entitled The Visual Archive, Documenting the Holocaust and Genocide Through Photography, and features a conversation with our guest speakers, Jeremy Dennis and Maya Benton. The Kufferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York is situated on the traditional land of the Shinnecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, was first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today, we identify those crimes for what they are: mass atrocities and genocide. These horrors continue to have devastating political, economic, social, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. Today's program is a collaboration between the Kufferberg Holocaust Center and the Museum and Gallery Studies program in the Art and Design Department at Queensborough Community College. It builds upon the KHC's longstanding tradition of connecting core themes within both Holocaust and human rights education, of erasure and tragedy, of visibility and resilience, with how they are expressed and taught within and at museums and education centers. This event is co-sponsored by the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College, the Ray Walpole Institute at Western Washington University, the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center, and the Museum Studies Graduate Program at the CUNY School of Professional Studies. After the presentation, be sure to submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And now it's my great pleasure to kick things off. Please join me in welcoming Kat Griffin. She's program coordinator and faculty member in the Gallery and Museum Studies program at Queensborough Community College and faculty member of Museum Studies in CUNY School of Professional Studies. Kat, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Laura, for the very warm welcome and introduction. And thank you also to Associate Director of the Kufferberg Holocaust Center, Marissa Hollywood, for your work on this program as well. Thank you to the Art and Design Department for support, Anne-Marie Coffey, Kenneth Powell, and Chair of the Art and Design Department, Kathleen Wentrek. I am faculty member and program coordinator for Gallery Museum Studies at Queensborough Community College. And our program is the only associate's degree in the discipline offered in CUNY, making it a uniquely affordable entry point into the field in our region. So I welcome questions about the program. Please feel free to reach out. Also, as a faculty member for the CUNY School of Professional Studies, Museum Studies, MA, I would like to thank our academic programs coordinator, programs manager, Jenna Copeland, for SPS's support of this event. Hello to all the students who are present and community members as well. This program is one of the four yearly events in this ongoing Human Rights in the Museum series, which, as Laura suggested, comes out of a living land acknowledgement resulting from the Native American Survivance Project at the KHC, which took the form first of a colloquium, exhibition, and publication starting in 2018. For this reason, Indigenous voices and viewpoints are centered in many of the series events, including this one. Today's program addresses how visual archives and photographs can serve as records of communities who have experienced genocide or mass atrocities. Topically, the presentations speak to photography as a means to both picture the destruction and the survival or survivance of Jewish and of Native communities. Now, more broadly, given the global focus on the war in Ukraine, it feels like an apt time to consider the power of visual documentation of human rights crises as they continue to unfold. We are very lucky and honored to have the artist and cultural arts worker, Jeremy Dennis, and curator and art historian, Maya Benton, here to speak about their work. In order of the presentations, I will first introduce Maya Benton. Benton has organized numerous international traveling exhibitions, lectures widely, and is frequent contributor to magazines, museum catalogs, where she writes about photography, museums, and material culture. Maya has held positions in museums for more than 25 years, including the Getty Museum, the RISD Museum, the Harvard University Art Museum, the Jewish Museum of Florence, Italy, and the Jewish Museum of Venice, Italy. From 2008 to 2019, Maya was a curator at the International Center of Photography in New York, where she established the Roman Vishniac Archive through a partnership between ICP and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She also organized the traveling exhibition Roman Vishniac Rediscovered. And in today's presentation, Maya will be speaking about the Vishniac Archive, and in particular, the photographers commissioned to document Jewish communities in Central and Eastern Europe just prior to World War II, as well as his related work depicting the Jewish refugees and Holocaust survivors post-war. In addition to her significant work on Vishniac, Maya recently organized an exhibition of photographer and filmmaker Gillian Laub's images of racial segregation in the American South that will travel through 2025. Benton is the founder and director of the Jews and Photography Initiative. She's a graduate of Brown University, Harvard University, and the University of Florence, Italy, and the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. Next year, she will be a visiting professor at Yale University. And I will also introduce Jeremy Dennis before I hand over the Zoom. Jeremy is our second presenter. He is a photographer and a tribal member of the Shinnecock Indian Nation in Southampton, New York. In his work, he explores Indigenous identity, culture, and assimilation. He has received numerous awards to support his work, including the Creative Bursar Award from Getty Images, as well as residencies at Yaddo, Birdcliff Artist Colony, Watermill Center, Vermont Studio Center, just to name a few. He has had solo exhibitions at the Parish Art Museum, Stony Brook University, Suffolk County Historical Society, among many other venues. Dennis holds an MFA from Pennsylvania State University and a BA in Studio Art from Stony Brook University. He lives and works in Southampton, New York, where he has also established Ma's House, a cultural center on the Shinnecock Indian Reservation. There, he has transformed the 1960s family home into a residency program for BIPOC artists, also hosting an array of cultural programs for tribe members and the broader community. Today, Dennis will speak about his project, On This Site, which is an interactive archive making use of photography and mapping to showcase culturally significant Native American sites on Long Island. The project also takes the form of a book and related exhibition. Now, I am pleased to pass the Zoom first to Maya Benton.
Thank you so much, Kat, for having me. I'm just gonna, first, I wanna express my gratitude to everyone who's organizing this event, especially Kat and Marissa and all of their work in making this happen so seamlessly. And I want to also mention I'm looking forward to a lively conversation and discussion once we've both presented our areas of research. I'm going to switch now to sharing my screen so I can get into the PowerPoint. I am going to be talking to you today about Roman Vishniac, and here's a picture of him taken in Moscow in the 19-teens. I'm going to get through a lot of images in about 20 minutes, but I'll be talking as I go through them. And I'm an art historian, so I love images. And in this archive of Roman Vishniac, we have 30,000 photographs, negatives, and contact sheets, and another 20,000 pages of ephemera. And so there's a massive amount of material, most of which had never before been seen or brought to the public. And I'd like to share with you as much as I can in this short amount of time, and also raise some of the bigger questions and challenges and discoveries of the archive, and explain how it has helped us to kind of reapproach and understand the way that the visual memory of Jewish life in Eastern Europe before the Holocaust had been formed largely through his images. Roman Vishniac is responsible for creating the most widely recognized and widely reproduced photographic record of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. And his iconic images have kind of stood as visual markers of memory for an entire annihilated world. And yet only about 350 of his images were published or printed during his lifetime. And they focused on the work from 1935 to 1938 that he took throughout Central and Eastern Europe. when he was commissioned by the JDC to take those photographs. So I'm going to be talking about the context of the commission, which is one of the great discoveries, and kind of going through his archive. And also standing back and looking in this brief amount of time at his kind of 60 years of work. Imagine if you had been working for 60 years as a photographer, artist, and then you were only known for 4 years of your work. So there's a question about why that work became so iconic, but also standing back and looking at his early engagements with modernism in Berlin in the 1920s and 30s, all the way to the 1960s and 70s with his pioneering color scientific photomicroscopy. So you get the sense of the man and his life's work, and then his iconic images from Eastern Europe. So just to give you a quick background into Vishniac and his life. Roman Vishniac was a Russian Jew born in 1897 in Pavlovsk, which was a small town on the outskirts of St. Petersburg. And he was raised in Moscow in an upper class family. His family was one of the 7,000 Jewish families who were given rare exemptions by the Tsar to live and work outside the Pale of Settlement. And so he was given the freedom to kind of live and work and study in Moscow, which very few Jews at the time were. He was really interested in biology and zoology and also microscopy. And that kind of formed the nexus of his research and passions when he was in Berlin. He was also an advocate of kind of amateur photography. His family gave him the newest cameras and gadgets for his birthdays. On his 7th birthday, he was given his first camera and also a microscope. He attached the camera to the microscope and he took a 3 times magnified photograph of a cockroach's leg. And that became his first photograph. And so his interest in photography and in scientific exploration was present from his earliest engagements with photography. And he was also steeped in Soviet camera culture, which was largely Jewish camera culture. Most of the small photo studios operating in Moscow and St. Petersburg in the 19-teens were Jewish owned. And so he was steeped in this kind of Soviet Jewish camera culture at the same time that he was pursuing his scientific research. During the Russian Revolution, his parents and sister moved to Berlin, and Vishniac decided to stay in Moscow to pursue his zoological studies. He was in graduate school and did pioneering work on the axolotl, which is, here you can see, a salamander. We had an intern in the archive several years ago who actually adopted an axolotl because she was so interested in his work. And then as the aftermath of the revolution unfolded, he realized he had to join his family in Berlin and it wasn't as safe for him in Russia. And so he met up with Luta Bog, who was a Latvian Jewish woman. Their families had known each other. They met in a Latvian border town. And these are pictures he took with his hand-cut Soviet negatives of Luta, kind of on their honeymoon after they got married in this Latvian border town. And you can see that he had arrived in Berlin at the age of 23, already an incredibly accomplished amateur photographer, totally self-taught. And these negatives were developed for the first time when we organized the exhibition. So when he came to Berlin, he started to navigate this thrumming urban metropolis through his camera. And he would position himself at the egress of their apartment building in Wilmersdorf, in the section of Berlin where a lot of Russian Jews came and kind of rebuilt their lives after the revolution. And he was navigating his new adopted city through his camera's lens. This is the famous Berlin Alexanderplatz, which was the kind of thrumming center of Berlin nightlife. He was also experimenting with kind of early engagements with modernism and interesting compositions and experiments in framing. This to me looks like a Fritz Lange film still. And these images were never before printed or published. We found this as a negative. You can see that it's a square negative. He used 2 cameras. He used a Raleigh and a Leica. The Raleigh made square frames and the Leica made rectangular frames. And he had the cameras from the very first moment that they were introduced to the market. He had bought these cameras. He came from an affluent family and he was able to afford the earliest technology. So what we see here is the first year that this iconic camera was introduced to the market and his earliest explorations with new approaches to modernism through his camera. And none of these images had ever before been seen, nor had he been considered as a pioneering modernist. But this to me looks like inflections of the Bauhaus. He was clearly influenced by modernism around him. And these are family photos. And this is Luther and Vishniac in Berlin. And in 1922, he had a son, Wolf, and then a daughter, Mara, who became the executor of the estate. She recently passed away. And here what you see is a picture of Mara with her father, Roman Vishniac. And it's actually a tiny photograph that is from the first photo automat or photo booth that was introduced to Berlin. It was in the Wertheim department store, which is actually in the very back of this image. And so he took his daughter to experience this new method of kind of quick photography, the photo automat. And I think this image is really poignant because it's also, Wertheim department store is one of the first businesses to experience anti-Semitic boycotting. It was an early target of Aryanization when the Nazis rose to power. And so this kind of signals a shift in their experiences in Germany. And I want to show you a few, hold on one sec, there's something going on here. A few other street photographs that he had taken. Here he was spending all of his time at the zoo because he was best friends with the zookeeper. So here's one of the advertising columns that they're taking down in front of the zoo. And you can see that he is navigating his adopted city as an amateur photographer in Berlin. He was a member of camera clubs. And this is when he was traveling to Vienna. And again, none of these images had ever been printed or published until we started to go through his negatives that had all been cut into individual squares. So we didn't have dates or captions and had to do a lot of work in kind of researching all of the dates, histories, locations of all of his photographs. Here he's experimenting with night photography. This is the famous Riesenrad, the famous Vienna carnival scene that appeared in several movies in the 1930s. And you can see that he's playing with light and shadow. And you see the reflection of Vishniac actually taking the photo in this horse's eye. He always loved animals. They had a pet monkey. There was a terrarium in their apartment. And he was continuing to pursue his scientific studies and starting to use magnification and photography to explore scientific developments that were not readily seen by the naked eye. And so this is, I think, a really beautiful picture of slime mold and a jellyfish. And he was pursuing his scientific research and photography in Berlin. But in the early 1930s, as the Nazis rose to power, the lives of German Jews radically changed. And I think this is a particularly poignant image. It was taken in the Berlin Zoo, which I mentioned was a favorite haunt of Vishniac's. And he shows the polar bears, the famous polar bears of the Berlin Zoo, as if they are the ones kind of looking at the people in the cages. And it was around the time that he took this photograph that Jews were no longer allowed to be members of the zoo, were prohibited from going and prohibited from participating in most aspects of middle-class daily life, including taking photographs. And at this time, he also wanted to document the rise to Nazi power. So he used his daughter, Mara, and there she is, as a prop. She was 7 years old. This was 1933, and this is the famous election of Hitler and Hindenburg. And he, as a Jew with the camera, wasn't allowed to go and take photographs on the streets. But he could say, oh, I'm just taking a picture of my daughter. And here she is modeling in front of a Nazi phrenology shop that's advertising the superior skull shape of Aryans. And as the Nazis rose to power, he shifted his attention to documenting the ominous changes that he saw on the street. So this looks like a beautiful street scene, but as you zoom in, you can see the swastikas. We were able to date this from the movie poster lining the streets. Here's another one from the same place. And then this looks like a picture of kids, playing on the street, but you start to see as you zoom in that there are swastikas lining the whole street. And so what had been in 1933, I'm zooming back, the kind of focus of his work, by 1935 and 1936 kind of became the quotidian backdrop for everyday life for German Jews in Berlin. At the same time, and here you see he's wearing a 1936 Berlin Olympic lapel pin with a swastika inside it. At the same time, his children were growing up in Berlin. There's his daughter in ice skating lessons, and they're celebrating Purim here. And they were surrounded by anti-Semitic propaganda. This was a very popular children's book that showed how these anti-Semitic advertisements were being marketed on the streets. And this is showing Jewish children being expelled from an Aryanized school. And Vishniac's own children were part of this community. So his children were kicked out of the Aryanized schools and sent to schools for Jewish children. And here is a photograph of Jewish children in Berlin in one of these Jewish schools that was created as a response to Jewish children being ejected from regular schools. And he started to turn his eye towards documenting German Jewish relief organizations and activities in Berlin. This shows the Jüdische Kulturbund membership card. So when Jews weren't allowed to go to the cinema, the opera, the theater, they created their own Jewish cinemas, theaters, opera houses. And here, the bottom, you see a sticker that was on the back of one of his photographs that shows his membership in the Frankfurt Jewish Camera Club. As Jews were prohibited from participating in camera clubs, they started to join Jewish camera clubs. Here's a Jewish kitchen that was meant to supply food and meals, warm meals to families that were no longer able to work. If you were a teacher, you couldn't work. If you were a doctor, you couldn't see non-Jewish patients. And so increasingly there was a need for relief. A lot of this funding came from America and the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which was at the time the world's largest Jewish relief organization. And they funded camps and schools. And what you see here is German Jewish kids learning how to become farmers so that they could move to Palestine. And they were waiting for their visas and desperately trying to leave Germany, and at the same time learning Hebrew, learning how to gather eggs, although this is a really avant-garde photograph. Here's a young Jewish kid in Berlin learning how to milk a cow. They're preparing for their new lives as pioneers in Palestine. And at the same time that he's taking these photographs of German Jewish daily life, Vishniac gets on the radar of these Jewish relief organizations that hire him to photograph Jewish life in Central and Eastern Europe. And so at that point, he goes to Europe for his first trip in 1935. This is one of his most iconic images. It's called Grandfather and Granddaughter. And it was part of, it was part of a body of work that became his iconic images of the vanishing world of the Eastern European Jew. It focused on the most kind of religious, the most observant, and the most poor. And these images became part of this book, The Vanished World, that was published in 1980. It went into 12 printings. It sold over 1 million copies. It is considered the most readily found book in Jewish homes after certainly photography books. If you think that there are only 3.5 million Jewish homes in America and that almost 1 million of these books were sold, it's pretty incredible to think about how iconic these images were in reconstructing what that world was like. Vishniac claimed throughout his life and to his death that his photographs were the product of a kind of self-imposed assignment. He had premonitions of the Holocaust. He understood and believed Hitler's bombast, and that all that was left was for him to kind of preserve the faces of those who he kind of anticipated were marked for annihilation. And he was asked on NBC radio, were you sent on assignment? And he said, no, I was sent by God, and that assignment I followed. But we now know that actually all of his photographs of Jewish life in Eastern Europe that documented poverty and religious, mostly Jewish men, because they were marked as Jews by their dress, whereas Jewish women and Gentile women looked similarly. All of these images that came to represent that world were the product of a documentary assignment to depict the poorest, most destitute, and most kind of authentic Eastern European Jews. So it's as if I said, let's raise money to provide relief for homeless shelters in New York. And we hired a great photographer who documented the homeless families, the things that would most pull on your heartstrings. And then there was a natural disaster and New York, fell into the ocean. And then 100 years from now, people said, oh, this is what all New Yorkers look like. That is, to some extent, what the Jewish community has done is using Vishniac's images that were the products of an assignment to depict the poorest and most religious to recreate what that vanished world was. And so as we started to go through the negatives, not the 350 images that were published or printed, but the larger body of 10,000 negatives, 10,000 prints, and then contact sheets and slides, we started to see and this is how it looks now, very organized, we started to discover incredible photographs. First of all, I think his best photos were never printed or published. This is an incredible composition of these two impossibly pointed roofs with this wonderful line here, mimicking the lines of the sheet, everyone kind of looking at the photographer with a different expression. And here you see, this is a basement dwelling in Warsaw, actually the same street that I.B. Singer had lived on, but it's also an incredible modernist construction of this vertical register of kindling wood in this corner of a Yiddish newspaper, mimicking this corner of lace and the boy's face in the corner. And so even in his images that we discovered that document poverty, there's a profound modernism and innovation in his unpublished work that hadn't been seen. This is again a basement dwelling in Warsaw. And this is one of his most iconic images, taken of a grandmother and grandchildren in the same basement dwelling. At the same time that he was commissioned by the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or the JDC, to take photographs of Central and Eastern Europe, Dorothea Lange and the Farm Security Administration photographers, the New Deal photographers in America, were being employed by the American government to take pictures of poverty, so that those images could be used to raise consciousness and support for relief initiatives. So this is a photograph by Walker Evans of a sharecropper's family and Vishniac in a basement dwelling. And all these photos were taken at the same time. Again, Walker Evans in Selma, Alabama, and Roman Vishniac in Bratislava. And I'll just go through a few of these. They were all taken at the same time. And so part of the discovery of the context of the commission, that we now understand that Vishniac's iconic images were the product of a documentary assignment, is to really understand him in this broader context of commissioned social documentary photography of poverty, and to then reconstruct our understanding of Eastern Europe with that in mind. So here's a picture Vishniac took of a girl bringing soup to her mother and a bottle of milk. This is another iconic image of Sarah. The story was that she had no shoes because she couldn't afford, she couldn't work, and so the family couldn't afford to give her shoes. So in the winter, she had to stay in bed, and there was a flower painted above her head, and her father called it the only flower for youth. This image was reproduced on tzedakah cans, or charity tins, that were circulated through Europe. And here, this was one of the great discoveries. It's only a piece of paper, but to me, this was like the great discovery in our research, was that she was actually used as the literal face of the campaign for relief in 1938. So this shows how Vishniac's images were deployed at the time that they were commissioned. And here are a series that he'd published called, I call them Shopkeepers with Nothing to Sell. And the story was that because of all the anti-Semitic boycotts in Poland, these shopkeepers' shelves were bare. And those images were used to show potential donors in Western Europe and in Chicago and New York and Los Angeles to raise money for the plight of the interwar destitute Jews who were suffering these crippling anti-Semitic boycotts. But here's an unpublished image of a woman shopkeeper in Warsaw. First of all, she's a woman. She's looking directly at him. Her shelves are full, and this is another representation of that world at the same time that was never published or printed. These are the images that were known, and these are the images that were not known. So his iconic images of kind of Orthodox and bearded Jews, for which he is most, known, were the things that I grew up being aware of. And then in 1992, a book came out that was the first posthumous publication of his work, To Give Them Light. And you'll see on this post the town Novogrudek, which is where my whole family is from. And I remember everyone in my family like screaming with excitement and joy about this, and everyone on the phone in Tel Aviv and New York and Los Angeles freaking out. And it wasn't even about a photograph of the town. It was a photograph with the name of the town on a signpost, which shows you how much attachment there was to anything related to this kind of shared memory that had largely been annihilated. And so these are family photos that I grew up with. This is my grandmother here in the middle, and here she is there on the back of a motorcycle in the small town. This is the town ambulance with the town beauty on the hood. This is my great-grandmother. And these are Vishniac's photographs. And I'm not saying that one is more real than the other. It's just that both truths existed at the same time, that photographs of middle-class daily life, amateur snapshots, show, I think, a more accurate, realistic representation of the wide range of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. Whereas the iconic images that came to stand for that world represented the product of commissioned assignment to document poverty. And because of the conversation we'll be having later, I wanted to add in this Edward Curtis photo of the vanishing race from 1904, because I think that representations of Native Americans and this notion of like the kind of last authentic or vanishing race and vanishing people and the vanishing world, and the way that we have kind of attached nostalgia to our selective view of how we depict that world, there's a lot in common between depictions of Native Americans and Jews, and hopefully we'll get to that conversation. But these were the images that were published, and then these images were never published and printed, and they show women. Here's a photograph that if it had been published, it would have been cropped out just to show this Orthodox Jewish man. But in the negative, you see this middle, this secular woman with her sleeves rolled up. And you see depictions of women in the unpublished work. This was one that we had never seen before, but when you got to the back of the print, it reads Satmar Mare, which is the seat of the Satmar Hasidim, which is the most kind of ultra-Orthodox community. And if this woman were walking around the Satmar section of Borough Park or Mea Shearim, in Israel, dressed like this, she would be kind of kicked out of the community. And yet here she is in the center of town. And it shows that in many ways, we've recreated a view of observant Jewish life, largely based on Vishniac's photographs, that doesn't tell the whole story. This is the published image. And then this image that was never published is of these two young porters. They're also poor. Their clothing is in tatters. They were porters because most professions were prohibited to Jews. And so being a porter or carrying heavy loads was one of the few things Jews could do. But if you look at the published image and the unpublished image, you see the selective way in which we have framed notions of that world. These are also two unpublished photos of porters. You see, this is a really modernist photograph. And this is a shoemaker, but you see this kind of bird's eye constructivist aesthetic. This is the image I opened with. And so in the unpublished work, you see modernism and you see youth. And even in the most iconic images, this was the cover of that book I was mentioning, To Give Them Light. The cover is cropped in on this Orthodox boy in the center. But when you see the full frame of the negative, even though this is an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva, a group of students in an ultra-Orthodox school, you see a much more vibrant and more diverse representation of that world. You also see a girl in the backgrounds. And even in the most iconic images by Vishniac, this is the one that was on the cover of his first book, Polish Jews. He called this his Rembrandt. We actually found this person. His name is David Eckstein. He was a Buddhist who lived in the Catskills until he recently died. We've identified about 30 subjects of Vishniac's photographs and have their testimony and stories from when Vishniac took his photographs. And so in some way, his images were frozen in time. And now that we're getting these stories of later in life, it takes things out of this kind of frozen narrative of the pre-war version of the nostalgia for those kind of idyllic years. And now we can update people's stories and their own reflections on their lives when those photographs were taken. This is one of the famous yeshivas or schools of learning in Eastern Europe. And this was published. The unpublished image shows them at break, kind of eating and playing around. And I think I have a lot more to show you, but I think I'm taking up too much time. So I'm going to wind down now. And I think we can get to conversation a little bit later. With that, I'll pass the screen off and hopefully I'll be able to share more images with you moving forward.
Thank you so much, Maya. You covered so much and many things that I hope that we can get to in the Q&A. Now I'm very pleased to go ahead and pass the Zoom mic to Jeremy, and just remind folks that they are very welcome to post questions in the Q&A, which we can get to after the second presentation. Jeremy, welcome.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Dennis. I'm an artist and photographer from the Shinnecock Indian Nation in Southampton, New York, which is about 2 hours east of New York City. I want to thank you, Kat and Griffin, for inviting me today to present as part of this ongoing series on human rights and the museum. During my 25 minutes or so, I hope to talk a little bit about Shinnecock, where I come from, as a little bit of context, and my On This Site Indigenous Long Island project as it relates to visualizing the archive and genocide through photography. And so I love mapping, so I'm going to include the second map, well, second of many. This is an illustration by David Bunn Martin from 1992, And I put a little blue star approximately where the present day Shinnecock Reservation is. And I always love to start with these, or I should say my own form of a land acknowledgement, just because it's always a good reminder of land disposition of Indigenous people, just the ongoing commitments that we have towards a more just future. And everything that we do depends on land and space that we have today. And so with this land and with the things that we have, it's important to give whenever possible. This is also a good illustration of the 13 original tribes, 2 of which today have a land base in present day. And so this is the community center here on the Shinnecock territory. I just want to start with a little bit of background here. We're the only federally recognized tribe on Long Island out of those 13. We received this title back in 2010. A little bit more about Shinnecock. The territory itself is about 800 square acres of land. There's about 600 of us who live on the physical territory, whereas there's 1,800 of us in total throughout the world, which is great. I also proudly tell people that we've been here for over 10,000 years. And it's only been in the last 400 to 500 years that we as Shinnecock and other Indigenous people in the United States have faced genocide of people, genocide of culture. At first, it was genocide by disease, war, missionaries, boarding schools, forced assimilation, the adoption systems, slavery, and today it's the dehumanizing perpetuation that Native Americans are no longer here. It's painful that, like we all know that we have this general understanding of these struggles and these trials that we've survived, but it's even more painful that people deny our present day existence, even our own neighbors. And so going back to mapping, this is a satellite image of the territory itself. And we're surrounded by the Shinnecock Bay on 3 sides of our territory. My grandmother is noted for saying, we're still here because there was just nowhere else for the colonists to push us back to. And so this is just a good illustration of our resilience just through the mapping itself. This is our tribal Cnr Flag. It has a lot of symbolism behind who we are as a people. Right in the center is the Indigenous box turtle. It has 13 sections for the 13 tribes. We have the notable 2 right whales, which are indigenous to our Atlantic coasts. And the Shinnecock Indian Nation text is something unique. As you see on the outside, that's more of a font that we're used to, but this is actually done using something that we call wampum beadwork. And so wampum is the process of taking our local clamshell that you can find surprisingly just from New Jersey to Maine and Canadian Atlantic beaches. It's a common clamshell, but in this region alone in the world, our clams get this purple hue. And so for thousands of years, Shinnecock and other people in New England who are indigenous to this area took that clamshell. They rendered it into these beads that you see on the right, and they used them for pendants, for belts, later for currency with the Dutch and other European powers. And this is the most famous example of rendering those shells into a belt or something that in this case represents the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy. Going back to mapping, this is probably our most important map and symbolic of what we're fighting for today. This is a map of pre-1859 Shinnecock territory, everything in the dark tone, most identifiably through the center text that says Shinnecock Tribe and Indian Reserve. And so this is a important map to us because in 1859, this land was stolen from us using deceit, forged signatures, trying to bribe different Shinnecock people into signing something. And so the land itself was unfortunately taken for the reason of turning the East End into a resort, and the other reason of bringing the Long Island Railroad from the west to the east. And so it sort of does have that same identity today, which just goes to show how the past informs the present and shows a very clear path as to how we got here today. And so I put a little green rectangle around the area of our current day reservation, just to give you a little bit of context of how our land has dwindled. I love this image as well because on the right, that's my mother, Denise Silva Dennis. She is also an artist and educator. And on the left is my aunt, Darlene. And this photo was taken in 2010 when we got our federal recognition after 30 years of petitioning. And at that point, we joined over 570 other federally recognized tribes in the United States. It offers us different ways of practicing our sovereignty. I like to describe it as we're kind of like a country within a country now at that point. And this next map kind of illustrates the overwhelming number of different indigenous groups here in America alone. And so I always laugh because you don't see Shinnecock, but you see Montauk. Montauk is one of the 13. And it's just so incredible that there's just such a diverse group of nations, as you can see. I think that the thing that we're all trying to change in our different Native communities is the fact that even today, schools still generalize that there's this one monolithic Native American group or Native American history, not really mentioning individual groups. And this sort of stigmatizes and suggests a false idea that all of these groups don't really have their own say, they can't self-govern. And it's part of just different ways of simplifying who we are and trying to render us invisible, not really having the ability to exist on our own. And so here at Shinnecock, we're probably most known for our Labor Day weekend powwow. We've been having this gathering of nations since 1946, and Shinnecock's is actually the largest on the East Coast. It's a 4-day event, and unfortunately, for the past 2 years, we've had to cancel it due to COVID. But the really staggering and crazy thing is that, according to recent surveys in general, 30% of Indigenous people identify as craftspeople. So if you've never been to a powwow, it's a event of dancing. It has singing, drumming, and on the perimeters of the property are different vendors selling their art, their beadwork, their craft. And so for these 2 years, this 30% of our communities or relatives were unable to support themselves. So we try to invite people to come every single year. I always say it's a little bit different each year. And so I'm about to jump into my on the site project, but I do want to mention that I do portraiture as well. I do work based on our creation stories as Native people. I do work that's more in like the contemporary art realm, just commentary on current issues. And I mention this because portraiture is a really important way to socialize art, just a way to meet new people. And just according to various polls, to give you more meaning and context, back in 2015, according to a poll, 40% of participants admitted not knowing that Native Americans exist. And a different poll suggested that 62% of non-Native Americans reported not knowing a single Native American, even though we represent 5 million people in the United States. And we live 70% in urban areas. So there is this really big disparity between being acknowledged and the historical idea, as Maya was saying, of this vanishing race. And so this is where we enter into on this site, trying to dispel the idea that we are vanished and we don't really have a say in today's world. This is a project that I began in 2016 as part of a grant from a nonprofit called Running Strong for American Indian Youth. And part of this grant is supporting Native youth all throughout the country, doing projects in athleticism, culture, arts, health. And I was very lucky in 2016 to receive this funding to essentially pursue a project that uses my understanding and skills as a landscape photographer and accompanying these photographs by research, mostly site-specific histories, sacred sites as they relate to Indigenous people. And it's a survey of all of Long Island. So it's Brooklyn to Montauk. It includes the different islands within the region, the North and South Fork. And I'm based in Southampton, so I have a lot of work to do in the eastern region of Long Island. And so I do want to mention just a little bit more context. I attended public school for most of my personal education growing up, and you really wouldn't know anything about Shinnecock, like that we had a significant history or had any contribution or really mattered in terms of what we were taught and what was prioritized in school. And according to those 2015 studies, 80% or more of content taught about Native Americans was taught in the pre-1900 context. And so in other words, we as youth were taught Native Americans once existed, they're no longer here, but these are the ways that we once interacted with them. And so it really instilled in me and many other generations the idea that Native Americans are just a historical note or a static people stuck in the past. In addition to this, some of the research that I came across early on in my On the Site project was sort of in that vein of, I think everyone knows the film Last of the Mohegans. Maya also mentioned the photography of Edward Curtis and the mission to try to document the last of Native Americans as they still exist. And so these are just different articles that I came across in historical societies, different libraries. Like you can go to your local library today and probably see some different newspaper clippings that say, like, one of your elderly community Native Americans just passed away. This must signify the last of, in our case, the Shinnecock. It could be the last of the Montaukets. These were just different myths that were perpetuated. And in my perspective, this was a powerful story to perpetuate, because if you were trying to colonize the area and you needed land was the most valuable thing. You needed this story of the indigenous people who were pretty much the stewards of it all, that they were eventually going to disappear. And we really need to claim this for our own before anyone else does. And so what happens when you just have this lack of visibility and lack of acknowledgement? For us today in the 21st century, it affects our sovereignty. If people don't know that you're there, if people don't acknowledge, like, they might see you, but they might not accept that you are Native American because they don't have the stereotypical features. And so this affects our ability to practice economic development. It reduces public support for our development projects. And it just really overall is just a negative experience of people not having that sense of belonging for Native Americans outside of either history books or the reservation. And so if you want to, you can go to jeremynative.com/on-this-site, but I'll go through a couple of different screenshots as well. If you click on one of the icons on the map, it might show you something like this. Since I'm from Shinnecock, I'll be biased and include this slide. But it shows a landscape photo that I took. It also shows you information in the form of Wikipedia, along with references. I think it's really healing for me to be able to take information, put it out in a public and free accessible way. And I think just storytelling in general is a very indigenous sort of element to who we are. And so just being able to tell these stories that have been either marginalized or overlooked or omitted from different books is such a powerful feeling. And so when I started the project, I was probably 25 at the time, not really knowing anything about Shinnecock, where I came from. And so it is a really fun process of just empowering oneself, trying to deny the fact that, like, we're not supposed to be here according to essentially the US government. And so the practice is really the act of going to these archives, just trying to transcribe or type up a lot of these things that I find. If possible, I try to pinpoint exactly where this history took place and just go out and photograph it. And so the reason I chose to do it in a site-specific manner was, first of all, the indigenous connection to land. Like, we've had these connections for thousands of years, so it made sense to sort of cement ourselves, or re-cement ourselves, I should say, throughout the landscape. But it also made Indigenous history more relevant to those who say, especially when I was growing up, I heard this a lot. Like, that happened so far ago in the past, like, you're still stuck on that. Other people would say, oh, that was my great grandparent that enacted that genocide, or they sent your ancestors away for slavery. It wasn't me, so I'm totally omitted from any consequence or responsibility. But I try to do it in a site-specific manner because these are sites that we visit every day. People live on unceded lands or stolen lands and benefit from that process. And so it isn't really like a colonial age that came and went. I think the institutions that we exist in today are still in that realm. And so some of these sites are site-specific histories. Others are Algonquin place names. One thing I listened to recently was just some of the Shinnecock experiences. The fact that because we're so far in the Northeast and so close to the first contact area, a lot of our languages and cultures, ceremonies, ways of everyday living was so disrupted that today people ask very ignorant questions like, oh, you don't know your language, you must not be native, or you don't practice things like sweat lodge, so you obviously are no longer Indigenous. But people don't realize that we've survived so many layers of cultural stripping and being forced not to practice these things, or else we would either be sent away to slavery, we would be tortured in public settings, we'd be hit or beat or killed if we disobeyed these laws. And so when it comes to site-specific names, it's really empowering to just include them in any format. Like, even if we don't know the translation, it's still important to acknowledge them, put them out into the map itself, and just visualize like all these different places that still have these names, which is incredible. And so, as it was mentioned before, the project is not only a website, it's a book and a traveling exhibit as well. I want to include this slide because this is really the first archaeological evidence of how long we've been here, here on Long Island. Archaeologists have studied these Clovis projectile points. There's a handful that you can find throughout Long Island, but they are really the earliest evidence of this long legacy of our presence. I also include the history of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. We all know, at least vaguely, or heard of the Trail of Tears, in which in 1830, President Andrew Jackson became the architect of this Indian removal or Trail of Tears, in which the Cherokee Nation was forced to give up their land east of the Mississippi and travel somewhere about 800 miles over to Oklahoma, some of the present day communities there. And so 12,000 people or more were forced on this journey with very little resources and help. 3,000 or more died during this journey. And I always tell this story because even though President Jackson was this infamous president, even before him, Thomas Jefferson was also trying to suggest the need for the elimination of Native Americans. So it's really hard to even conceptualize the fact that the US government basically sponsored genocide in this way. And I know it's not the most uplifting or proud moment in our history, but it's also important to acknowledge this as part of who we are, because it better positions us to deal with these issues and face kind of who we are today, try to start that path towards reconciliation and starting a more just future. Going back to Long Island and some of the on the site project, just the fact that at least for Shinnecock's story, we remain on 800 square acres of land today. But in my on the site research, I came across something called shell middens. And on the left, if you've never been to the Mashantucket Pequot Museum in Connecticut, I highly recommend you go as soon as possible. They have this really awesome sort of like live village of what life was like for Native people before contact. And so on the left, I took this photo of a woman contributing shells to what is known as a shell midden. It's basically a garbage heap of used clam shells after you eat them. But to me and to many archaeologists, these little hills represent village sites. So you would have your village, you would have your wigwams, many people living next to a food source. They would discard all these shells in a pile, and it would pretty much represent the village sites of Native people. And so on the right side, we have the Shinnecock Hills Golf Club, which is a famous, I think it's one of the first in the United States, and it's about 5 minutes from our reservation today. And just in the foreground, you can see reminiscence of a shell midden, even though it's so close inland. I also want to show you Ashwag. This is one of the sites as part of the project, but this relates to shell middens because according to early historians, all along this body of water were 2 feet or more in height, shell middens along the edge. So it's really incredible to try to visualize like how many years have people lived on this land, how have they used it, where have they gone, and what can you still see of this presence today. I also want to jump to the Hawthorne site. This is another that you can read about on the map. But this is a site back in August 2018 when private residents were developing a house in the Shinnecock Hills, part of that landscape that was stolen from us in 1859. And in this photo, you can see one of the construction vehicles making a foundation. Right where it stopped, they actually found one of our ancestors' human remains, a human skull, along with a glass bottle, sort of in this fashion from the 17th century. And luckily for us, the Shinnecock Nation was informed by a neighbor. We gathered and protested the site because we've used this site for more than 3,000 years as our ancestral burial grounds. And so we pretty much knew before we even arrived that it was a likely possibility. And so the detectives on the scene actually mentioned this glass bottle. I pulled up this image that you see on this slide on my phone. They agreed and said it was the same exact color and style. And so that pretty much cemented it. But what ended up happening was the Suffolk County Police tried to argue that it was an MS-13 crime scene. They kind of disappeared. They reappeared with shovels and really crudely and forcefully just dug up our ancestors' remains and brought them to their headquarters. And for Indigenous people, we always try to do something called repatriation, or just trying to allow our ancestors to live in the place of rest where they intended to be. And so after convincing the police and after convincing the private developer over several weeks to sell the site for preservation, we actually were asked by Southampton Town to raise what was originally $450,000. They reduced it to $50,000 to try to preserve and restore the site to its natural state. And so it is really ironic and strange that going back to our really important map, I put a little blue dot where this Hawthorne site is located. It's really ironic that like this land was stolen from us in 1859, and now we have to pay $50,000 to $400,000 to preserve something that was never really compensated or agreed to be signed away. This is one of the other sites that was very close to that one as well. This is known as Sugarloaf Hill. And in the middle right of this image, you can see a large house with a large swimming pool. So for over 30 years, the site was desecrated. It was in private hands. Southampton Town ignored our pleas to preserve the site. But this is actually one of our 3,000-year-old ancestral burial sites. It's the #1 most sacred site for Shinnecock people. And it wasn't until this past year, 2021, that Southampton agreed to try to help preserve it. If you read in the news, Roger Waters of Pink Floyd actually helped in a major way to get that funding going. And we finally yesterday actually demolished the house and are on the path to try to restore it to its previous state. This is another site that we're really known for, the Shinnecock Monument. If you're a big fan of Trevor Noah and The Daily Show, and I think one of the hosts, Michael Acosta, they actually did a segment on the monument and the fact that like this is land that no one really knew was part of Shinnecock territory. Everyone thought that we were like trying to be belligerent and just build wherever we went, wherever we wanted. But on old maps, you can still see this sliver of land that the Sunrise Highway goes through, a highway that thousands of people drive through every single day in both directions. And so in May 2019, Shinnecock erected these two 3-story tall monuments and advertisement signs. And over several months, the New York State Governor, Andrew Cuomo, along with the Department of Transportation, tried to prevent this construction. They tried to sue our leaders so that we would have to submit just through financial means. But finally today, we have 2 of them erected, and they proudly advertise different ads for our economic development. And so I think it's just so incredible that you have this 2019 site, you have this 3,000-year-old site, and you have other sites that are 10,000 years old, all on the same map. It's something that we're really proud that we can say that we've been here for so long for. And so just going to Shinnecock itself, and I always try to approach art and my projects in terms of practicality. And so I always ask the question, like, what is at stake if this work isn't really done? That site I showed you before, Sugarloaf Hill, it was preserved for $5 million. And so if you're familiar with the East End, real estate, property, and transfers are really the #1 industry out here. And so we at Shinnecock know the value of our land. It's something that we try to never sell. And it's also something that we try to kind of invest in if possible. If we have the funds, we'll purchase land around us to try to regain our stolen lands. And so this is just a image of our southern tip. This is what we call the point. And sometimes when we're down here just relaxing or just enjoying the water, we sometimes joke that like they get to see our nice kind of nature preserve and we have to look across the water at the McMansions, as people call them. And so these are just the different sites that I still have to pursue. Everything in red I know is there. I just have to go and photograph it. And everything in blue and green are on the website so you can enjoy. This last slide is just a way that you can go to the website, read more about the project. And those are just 2 different up and coming exhibits that you can go and enjoy if you're in that area. But I want to thank you for listening, and maybe we can see if we have any questions.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I believe that this is, and Maya, these are very powerful presentations. I think Laura has a question to lead into some discussion, and we're going to go, just a quick note, till 5:15 at least, just to be able to have some time for discussions. Thank you both.
Yeah, I'm really sitting here quite stunned. Jeremy, I'm actually in the area that you've been talking about. And when I was driving here yesterday, I was just amazed that there's no memory for a lot of people who live here, like the sites, the names of towns, the names of places, and in looking at your website and the extraordinary work that you've done to document these sites. And as you just had this powerful slide with, the green and the yellow sites that you documented, but all of the red sites. And Maya, I'm also just thinking about the sheer volume of Vishniac's photographs. And so I just want to mention Raphael Lemkin was born 3 years after Vishniac was, and he was a Polish-Jewish lawyer. He coined the term genocide, and he's mostly known as being a Holocaust survivor. And most people assume the narrative of Lemkin is that the Holocaust influences his understanding of genocide. But in fact, he had been doing research on the Armenian genocide and the genocide of Native American and Indigenous people. And that's something that is kind of lost when we're talking about his history. And so I'm just really curious for both of you, and maybe for slightly different reasons, what's the impact of doing this work? Jeremy, you're working in a context where there's not that many people that know the history or are actively, as you mentioned, pushing back and sometimes violently. And Maya, in your case, I'm thinking also about, the narrative of the Holocaust is very entrenched. And even in our work, oftentimes, especially members of the Jewish community will push back and say the Holocaust is not a genocide. It's the Holocaust. And so there's also, a feeling like we have to hold on to the memory as it is. So in both of your cases, you're really filling in large gaps of history. And so I just wanted to reflect on that and offer the opportunity for you to let us know what you think.
I think there are a lot of questions built into what you asked. There was a philosopher named Moshe Halbertal who had said something once to me that I thought was so compelling in terms of the Vishniac work and also the way that we deal with kind of collective memory and trauma, which is that if you went to someone's house and their children had died in a car accident, you wouldn't see pictures of the accident. You would see pictures of their lives. And in so many ways, the way that we have reconstructed collective Jewish memory, largely through photographs, has been to focus on the annihilation, the trauma, the genocide, the Holocaust. And so when, for example, I show the picture of David Eckstein, who is the Buddhist living in the Catskills, who had been the iconic little boy in his photographs, people are always shocked because you kind of think it ends there. And most of the people, especially the poor Polish Jews he photographed, over 95% of them were murdered. But in the few who survived, you see a narrative of a life that continued that's so different from this kind of frozen in time myth that you attach to it and the kind of Holocaust backshadowing that you inevitably see. But I think, especially as living testimony disappears in the next few years of the survivors, and the way that memory has largely been constructed has been through testimony. I think photographs will bear an increasing burden in representing those vanished worlds, which is a complex term in and of itself, as we've discussed, but how we annotate those photographs and which photographs we select to tell those stories will become increasingly crucial as the survivors die out. And I think so often with testimony, it was like the Nazis came and herded us away, but the life that came before it isn't annotated. And I wish that I could go back in time 30 years to all the family photos and snapshots and portraits and have these annotations of what that life was like. Because I think that the Holocaust backsharding, if you look at a picture of Jewish kids from the 1930s in Poland, you cannot help but look at them and think most of these children were murdered. But you can't just look at pictures of the accident. You have to look at the lives that came before. And I think that vernacular photography, and that's one of the reasons why I throw in the family snapshots, I think are important, crucial to telling that story. And in terms of memory construction, and I think there are a lot of corollaries with the Native American community and kind of representations, photographic and artistic representations, that you take the most kind of ethnographically distinct and then you represent the whole. And so for Jews, that tended to be old, religious, bearded men. And so most American Jews can't identify and see themselves in that. And so I think one of the important contemporary applications to doing this work is that when you say, well, these were all, Vishniac would say, these were all wise men, these were all sages, these were all spiritual, people had a wide range of experiences and identities. And I think the unpublished images, the unimagined, unvisualized stories are much more representative of the way that young Jews live their lives today and can see themselves in that and then identify with those histories. So it isn't like these bearded Orthodox Jews who lived in this yeshiva world, which is what Vishniac captured. He also was considered a shtetl photographer. But actually, shtetls are small towns where it's 5,000 or less people, of whom half or more are Jews. 10% of his photographs were taken in shtetls. Most of his photos were taken in like Warsaw and Krakow and like Lodz, which was like the Pittsburgh of Eastern Europe, and young urban Jews can identify more with that urban experience, unions and protests and boycotts, right? And so I think in telling this story in a different way and taking it away from this kind of mythologized narrative, we do a lot to help people see their own history. And when you see your own history, you identify with it more and you care about it more.
Jeremy? Thanks, Maya.
I was just going to add that for the On the Site project, one of the big motivations is just trying to create agency around the work that still needs to be done, and the commonality or the shared experience that a lot of Indigenous people face, the fact that we've been forcibly removed from our ancestral territories, and many of us live on just slivers of our original land. And so through our different treaties, many of which were broken, if you look back at these different documents and this old history, you can actually see some of the ways that we still should be the stewards of the land, or we should still access these resources or still have our homelands. And so that's one aspect. The other is there's a stereotype about Native Americans that we abuse different substances, or there's issues that we like are lazy sometimes, or I think a lot of these are kind of missing part of the equation. The fact that, as Maya said, there's a trauma that we live with every day. The fact that if you do render people invisible, like what are they supposed to do besides kind of fall into like depression, or feel like there's nowhere in society that they can turn to, or feel like that's where they should be part of the community. And so the other aspect is just showing like, no, we're not just 800 square acres. We're all of Long Island and beyond. This is where we belong. These are where our ancestors once stood and thrived. And that's maybe something that we can once again do as a people. And so that's for our use and some of our personal mission, but it's also just for the outside non-natives to kind of work with us for reconciliation. Though it may be difficult, a lot of Indigenous people are working towards like different land back initiatives, but there's always the implication that like if we do that social good or that social justice, like who today gets affected, and how can we balance both sides of that equation?
I was thinking about this idea of site and place, because I think when we first were conceiving of this on this, we talked about on this site, maybe that's the title of the whole program, because it's so much about, there's a lot about location. Jeremy, I'm glad that you shared those photographs of yours, of your contemporary fine art practice, because I was thinking as I was watching and listening to Maya's presentation of this idea of the photograph with the figure versus the photograph without the figure. And then I thought, of course, that relatives are in all of your photographs of the land. It's just a different kind of relative. So I'm coming to a question. Jeremy, I wonder if you could speak to this idea of your other practice, right? Which usually does have the figure, but the land is also so key to those photographs. And then maybe to tie that in, Maya was thinking maybe you could share a little bit about your current project or your project that's traveling now as we close out and think about the future, because I think that work of yours also really relates to a lot of the mission of the Kufferberg Holocaust Center, and maybe to upcoming programs. So maybe Jeremy and then Maya, if that's okay.
Oh, sure. Well, the land is so important to us. It's really one of the few things that is like permanent. Like we've endured 400 years of forced assimilation, our culture being stripped from us through threats of violence or different means of just ending our existence. But I always remind people that the land will bring back a lot of these practices. It'll allow us to reconnect with our ancestors, just the ways that we steward the land and our Indigenous knowledge and worldview allows for that transformation and healing. And so within this body of work, it's just the fact that I'm reconnecting with these sites, I'm showing other people these connections, and I'm hoping to reactivate the sites through that new knowledge. And in my other bodies of work, I do a lot of portraiture just because of, as I mentioned, the social aspects. But I think in relation to Vishniac's work, you do need that just human like documentary work, because we're often just put into different stereotypes or just simplified in ways that are dehumanizing. The fact that like we're just a concept or a number, or we're like a past, or we are just a memory. But if you go out and photograph your community, this is a political act. It's an act of resistance and resilience. And it just shows that we're still here as a people. And our a lot of what we try to do as Native people is to honor our ancestors through that way and just create a path for future generations. And so I just really love being a photographer because it goes into that documentary role to pass on that information.
And I think, Jeremy's comments have made me think a lot about the relationship, Jewish kind of collective memory in the Holocaust to place. Because, when my grandmother died, my mother are survivors. And I said I wanted to go back to the town where she was from because her whole life, she said, there's nothing there to see. It's a cemetery. Go to London, go to Paris. There's nothing there for us. And there was this sense that is no longer our place. And when the Vishniac show traveled to Warsaw, I was walking around the streets of Warsaw, and I knew that 1/3 of the people who lived in Warsaw in the 30s were Jews. So I'm walking around the street, and there was like this ghostly presence that I could feel in the place that I didn't think anyone else was experiencing. And it was a very heavy load to walk around and think 1/3 of these people were Jews and they're all gone. And you feel it. And what do you do with a place like that? It's not our place anymore. It's not our ancestors, it's a very complicated relationship to place. And certainly a lot of photographers have gone and tried to take photos of absence. Like, this is where the Jews live. This is where Vishniac photographed, but now there are no Jews. And I've always been so dissatisfied by those photographs, right? Photographs of where they used to be, but they aren't any longer. But it's a very complicated thing, how you photograph absence and connection to ancestral places where you're no longer there. And a lot of Jeremy's work brings up those questions, I think, also in a Jewish and Holocaust context.
I'm honestly just sitting here, and I feel like we could have this conversation for a lot longer. There are so many different themes. And, Maya, I remember the first time I realized that part of my family also comes from Poland, and I just assumed it was shtetl life, and it's actually not the case at all. And also in Warsaw, that there's and I'm not going to remember the name of the couple that does this, but part of what they do is they go around to different places in Poland, and they see on door frames places where there were mezuzahs that used to be there. There's still often an imprint. So they would either photograph it, or in some cases, if the building is no longer in use, they will resuscitate that frame. And I'm just thinking a lot about the memories that are in places and in spaces that we walk by every day and don't necessarily acknowledge. And Jeremy, this goes straight to what you've been talking about the whole time, which is that the memory of people are here through names and roads and things like that. And I was just struck by even the houses and the land. And so it's all around us. But the question is, can we see it, and do we want to see it? And I want to thank you both so much for coming to this conversation today and presenting about your work. And this is also deeply emotional and political in what we're talking about. And I also want to extend my heartfelt great thank you to Kat and the Museum and Gallery Studies program. And thank you to everyone. I can tell you that this has been a wrapped conversation, usually toward the end. Sometimes we see people who stop, it's after an hour, and we're an hour and a half and people are still here. So we're really grateful to all of you for staying and tuning in. And thanks so much. And on behalf of the Kufferberg Holocaust Center, stay safe and be well. Thanks, everyone.